You know what's strange? We constantly talk about millennials. We analyze Gen Z like they're some kind of psychological experiment. But there's an entire generation quietly standing in the middle that almost nobody talks about. Generation X. The people who grew up between the late 1960s and early 1980s. They're your boss who never complains. The parent who rarely talks about their problems. The coworker who somehow knows how to fix everything. And here's the fascinating part. The psychology of Generation X may be one of the most unique psychological blueprints ever created, because they grew up in a world that forced them to become independent much earlier than most generations ever had to. To understand Gen X, you have to picture a very different childhood. Imagine it's the late 1970s. You're 8 years old. School ends at 3 p.m. You walk home. You unlock the front door yourself, and the house is empty. No parents, no phones to check in, no text messages asking where you are. Just silence. For millions of Gen X kids, this wasn't unusual. It was normal. They were what psychologists later called latchkey kids, children who learned very early that if something needed to be done, they had to figure it out themselves. If they were hungry, they made their own food. If they had homework, they figured it out alone. If something broke, they experimented until it worked again. And that early independence left a deep psychological imprint. Gen X didn't grow up expecting constant guidance. They grew up expecting to handle things on their own. That's why many people from this generation share a quiet kind of confidence. They don't panic easily. They don't need constant reassurance. They're used to solving problems in silence. But there's another layer to their psychology that most people overlook. Generation X grew up during a time when many of the institutions older generations trusted began to crack. They watched divorce rates climb. They saw companies lay off loyal workers. They witnessed political scandals that shattered public trust. For a generation raised on promises of stability, reality looked very different. And when expectations collide with unpredictability, something interesting happens in the human mind. People adapt by becoming cautiously realistic, not cynical, but guarded. Many Gen Xers learn to expect that life might not always follow the script, so instead of blindly trusting systems or institutions, they focused on something they could control: their own competence. If you can't control the system, you become good enough to survive it. That mindset shaped the way they approach work. Unlike some generations that emphasize personal branding or recognition, Gen X tends to operate quietly. They focus on doing the job well. They learn practical skills. They build reliability. And when problems appear, they solve them without making a big show of it. That's why so many workplaces rely heavily on Gen X leaders. They're often the calmest people in the room during a crisis. But here's where their psychology becomes even more interesting. Despite their independence, Gen X tends to form extremely strong loyalty toward individuals. Not institutions, not companies, people. This comes from the friendships they formed growing up. When parents weren't always around, friends became the support system. Neighborhood bikes rides, hanging out after school, shared freedom without supervision. Those friendships weren't organized by parents or structured by schedules. They formed naturally, and they often lasted for decades. So Gen X developed a kind of paradox. They're deeply independent, yet deeply loyal. They rarely ask for help. But if someone they care about needs help, they show up without hesitation. No drama, no social media post about it. They just appear and handle the problem. You can see this mindset in how they approach authority as well. Unlike older generations who often respected authority automatically, Gen X tends to respect competence instead of titles. If someone knows what they're doing, Gen X will follow them. But if someone has power without skill, their patience disappears quickly, because many of them grew up watching adults make mistakes. Political scandals, corporate layoffs, broken promises. All of that quietly taught them something important. Authority doesn't guarantee wisdom. Competence does. Another defining feature of Gen X psychology is their relationship with privacy. Remember, they grew up in a world before social media. Embarrassing moments didn't live forever online. Mistakes happened, people laughed about them, and eventually they disappeared. Because of that, Gen X tends to see personal information very differently than younger generations. To them, privacy isn't suspicious, it's normal. They're less likely to broadcast every thought, every feeling, every moment. Not because they're secretive, but because they grew up in a culture where personal life stayed personal, and this shapes how they communicate. Many Gen Xers use humor as a psychological shield, sarcasm, irony, dry jokes. It's a way of expressing emotion without exposing too much vulnerability. Instead of saying, "I'm stressed," they might make a joke about it. Instead of sharing fear directly, they laugh at the absurdity of the situation. Psychologically, humor becomes armor, a way to keep emotions manageable while still acknowledging them. But perhaps the most defining trait of Gen X is adaptability. They grew up in an analog world, rotary phones, paper maps, libraries instead of Google. But by the time they reached adulthood, the entire technological landscape changed. Computers, internet, smartphones, social media. In a single lifetime, they experienced one of the largest technological shifts in human history. And instead of rejecting it, most of them quietly adapted. They learned new systems, new tools, new ways of working, without needing constant attention for doing so. That's why some sociologists call Gen X the bridge generation. They understand both worlds, the slower analog world that required patience, and the fast digital world that demands constant adaptation. And maybe that's why they often feel slightly invisible. They're not the loudest generation. They're not constantly demanding recognition. They just keep things running, quietly, reliably, holding systems together while the spotlight shines somewhere else. But if you look closely, you'll notice something fascinating. When things break, when systems fail, when chaos appears, it's often someone from Generation X who steps forward, rolls up their sleeves, and fixes the problem. Not because they want credit, but because they've been preparing for that moment their entire lives. And maybe that's the most Gen X trait of all. They don't need the spotlight. They just need things to work.